Welcome to Leaders of Life Sciences, the podcast where we spotlight the people shaping the future of pharma and biotech. Each episode, we speak with founders, senior execs, scientists, and strategists about how they lead, what drives them, and the real impact they're making on teams, organizations, and the lives of patients. If you want fresh insight into what great leadership looks like in life sciences, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Okay, welcome everybody to the podcast. Today we are honoured to have Stan Glezer, Managing Director at Outcome Capital. He's got nearly 30 years of experience spanning clinical research, med affairs, R&D, commercial strategy, and Stan has led transformative projects in medtech and biopharma. He engages at the very top of the industry to lead life sciences transactions with an at Outcome Capital, and they've won multiple awards over the last couple of years, showcasing the great work that they do. So Stan, absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, William. Pleasure being here, and thanks for dating me.
Pleasure. So may I ask, Stan, so first question I always like to ask at the beginning is what would you say makes you most proud to work in this industry and in your career within life sciences so far?
Yeah, so look, I'm a physician by training, right? And I started in this journey with an idea of helping people and treating the diseases and supporting the population and living happy and longer lives. And then I transitioned in the industry, so I led a number of projects in terms of new drug development, commercialization, new medical devices. So that was great. And what I really like about my current job, being in the life science investment banking and strategic advisory, is that I actually get to help a large number of innovative companies to bring their new technologies and ideas to the bedside. So I think that, it's a very tangible and scalable impact. That's kind of what makes me excited.
Yeah, nice. There's so many people that I speak to that are right at the top that are very purpose-led and mission-led about what they do, particularly within life sciences. So really interesting to hear. So look, you've got quite a varied background, right? As you even allude to there. With your experience, so it's 30 years, clinical research, med affairs, R&D, reg, commercial roles. You've seen the whole kind of spectrum, done everything there is to do.
I haven't worked in HR and I didn't work in legal. I mean, I'm not retired yet, so I can't.
Okay, there's time yet. Okay, we've got those two that you haven't done. With such a wide experience and wide viewpoint in the industry, like what benefit do you think that has given you into kind of what you're doing now and having the kind of impact you want to have?
So, my kind of general view of the life sciences industry is that, while the idea or concept might be born out of, one or two or three people just sitting in the corner and running the research and coming up with this wonderful thing, to turn it into the product and actually have that product introduced to the market in the way that's scalable and impactful does take collaboration across multiple functions, geographies, types of expertise, types of resources, and so on. So the key to success is really in that cross-functional collaboration. Sorry for using that kind of, beaten-up term, but I really believe that, no single function and no single individual can actually pull it off. When you collaborate across those boundaries, there is nothing that makes it more efficient than actually the ability to understand the needs and the ways of operation of other functions that are there. So, having worked in many of those functions, it gives me kind of an insider perspective. And that was true when I was, in the industry working on drug development and medical device development, commercialization. And it certainly helps me now as I'm acting as the strategic advisor and an investment banker to the innovation-led firms.
It must be interesting for you to understand the dynamic, if you like, but within these organizations from these different viewpoints as well.
Yeah, the dynamic, the priorities, the way of managing risks, managing resources, the incentives and those functions, because they're not the same. I mean, when you work in R&D versus when you work in sales, I mean, the way you think, the way you approach your day-to-day, and the way you set your priorities are totally different.
So for you, when we look at kind of how you're perhaps advising organisations that they lead this as well within the business, what recommendations do you have for people when you've got all these different people, different priorities, different ways in they set up their day, but the same outcome that they're all driving towards. Like, how do you manage those competing perspectives, competing demands of different stakeholders? How do you advise people to manage those?
Right. So I think that there are two broad categories of people in the organizations. And it's not that one is better than the other, but there is basically a role for people who are deeply specialized in what they do. And there is a role for people who provide more general direction, governance, who act as facilitators across function. And you need both. Right? I mean, you cannot just go with one type or the other. And I think that when you are engaging into those collaborative conversations, you clearly need to think as to what role are you playing. And if you are very clear about it, you maximizing your value. Conversely, I think one of the pitfalls of the larger, not always large, but I mean, organizations that do really heavily rely on such collaborative dynamic is that oftentimes people who end up in the facilitator or leadership roles are coming from being in the past deep experts. And that presents a bit of a challenge because not everybody actually makes the transition in their mind. So they are now in this more generalist facilitator roles, but they're still acting as specialists. And the problem is that once you have stepped out of the specialty arena, very quickly you lose your edge and you lose the depth of your knowledge. So you're no longer a specialist while you think about yourself like that. And that creates a problem. And frankly speaking, the biggest disasters that I have seen throughout my career was when specialty decisions were taken by the generalists. You need to leave the appropriate decision making to the appropriate type of roles.
Okay. What kind of challenges does that typically lead to? I know for different departments and depending on the decision, but if we're looking at, typically what kind of challenge the now generalist who thinks they're a specialist making decisions that a specialist should be made that should be making, what problems does that cause?
It goes in one of the two directions. One is that the generalist is recognizing that they don't have sufficient depth and they keep on asking questions, trying to educate themselves to the level of becoming specialist again. And then, you go through multiple rounds of reviews and, tons of questions. And that doesn't really add value because that knowledge does exist at the appropriate level of the organization. So an ability to actually let go and let the specialist take specialty decisions is one of the ways of actually moving forward faster. The other big issue is actually inappropriate or erroneous decisions. Because when the generalist thinks that they got it, and take a decision, they actually might be missing a whole bunch of nuances. The one situation that I vividly remember, when I was working on a new product and there was a discussion about, something as impactful and at the same time as benign as a brand name. As usual, we've done market research, comparison of the alternatives, the lookalike, sound alike, the regulatory risk, the legal with the brand trademarks. I mean, a lot of highly specialized work of a lot of people. And then the executive committee of the organization sat down and for 45 minutes debated between people who have not done that work as to what letter should be in the middle of that word. I mean, it's probably intellectually stimulating to the participants, but it's essentially negating weeks of work of the team that came up with that recommendation based on all of that analysis and, pretty deep expertise involved, right? So what I'm trying to say is that the decision might work out, but it's more of a, lucky chance than because, the executive committee taking the decision was properly equipped to do so.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. I guess that must take for somebody that's been a specialist and then they get to the top and they're going into this kind of more generalist position and they have to now hire people that are smarter than them or at least rely on the people that are smarter than them within the role. But it sounds like these are also people that if they've always thought of themselves as specialists, they've got an identity that's attached to that. They recognise that or they still believe they're the specialist. How would let's say somebody's listening to this right now and go, that's not me. Right, but nobody ever thinks it's them. So somebody's listening in right now, go, that's not me. What kind of warning signs might be flagging up to go, maybe that is me? Like if I'm that person making the specialist decisions when I shouldn't be, what might be happening in my world that means that I need to be perhaps improving my level of self-awareness of where I'm weak and deferring to other people and asking them to make those stronger decisions?
Right. So, maybe let me try to address it from a bit of a different angle, from the
Okay.
angle of definition of the leadership, right? I subscribe to the idea that the primary role and responsibility of the leader is to make themselves obsolete, meaning get the team that is working for you or with you to the level where they function to the same level of performance or better without you. That's if you can get the team to that level, you have succeeded. And in order to do that, you need to understand what is the value of the people on the team from the perspective of their contribution, their expertise, their dynamics between themselves, and so on. You need to think about what level of decisions can they make comfortably, and what would be a stretch, and how do you train and coach them to get to higher level of decision making, so essentially at some point they can substitute you within the area of their expertise and responsibility. I think that if you take that lens, then suddenly you start thinking very differently. It's not like, okay, how can I solve for it? No, how can I enable my team for solve for it? And that automatically puts you out of that need to be always, deeply involved in everything and understanding every single detail and, doing the work of the whole team underneath you, right? So,
Yeah.
or with you. So that's where I think that's how I see, the best way of solving that dilemma.
Okay, so your role becomes more about facilitating the people doing the doing as opposed to being the one in there doing it, making the decisions yourself.
Well, I mean, the latter part, yes. I mean, you should not be doing stuff yourself if you are a leader. Otherwise, I mean, just stay in the expert roles. And frankly speaking, I have worked with quite a number of people who did not want to progress. They were very comfortable and very good at what they were doing. That was giving them joy and pleasure, and they were most efficient in that capacity. Promoting them to the leadership role or asking them to work across it just would not have been a good thing. But then there is another category of people who actually want to do this and they need to progress accordingly, right? So that's kind of the way I think about it. But then coming back to your other question in terms of being a facilitator, I think that, an efficient leader has to be flexible in their style, depending on the level of maturity of the team. At some point, leader might need to be very dictatorial, and at some point, the leader might, be just a facilitator or even an observer if the team is functioning at a way higher level. So what I'm saying is that with all means and tools possible, the leader should progress the team to the higher levels of maturity and autonomy.
Okay. Okay. One question that's come to mind as you run through it, for context, everyone listening, we had a bit of we've got an outline on what we're running through. We've gone a little bit off off here a little bit, but I think this is really
That's the beauty of the
interesting.
conversation.
Stan, when you're looking at life sciences organisations that you work with and you kind of invest your time energy into, what are you looking for from leaders in these organisations that makes you think, well, they're the kind of organisations that we want to help and want to partner with?
Right. So I think that, I mean, the general leadership qualities that we discussed, I think, are absolutely paramount. But then you have to put them in the context of particular skill set that's required at a given time in the life cycle of a company. So for example, if I'm working at the, junction of the transition from academic research to the new biotech startup, I mean, the company will be heavily involved in continuing the preclinical research work that they were doing and the bench studies and whatever. I mean, I would like to see a strong scientist at the helm who can, navigate and coordinate this, and hopefully somebody who has done that kind of work before. But then once the company moves into the stage of actual product development and research are very vastly different from the perspective that in research there is a lot of ideation, there is a lot of tinkering, there is a lot of, I mean, it's a very creative and dynamic field. Development is all about strategic, operational implementation and discipline around it. Project management, risk management, budget management, driving to the outcome, managing timelines. It's a very different skill set. And not everybody who is coming from that, very vibrant, ideation environment is good at having that. So I'm looking for somebody who has done development work. And then if we're looking at the pre-commercial or commercial stage company, I actually want to see the commercial leader, somebody who's done sales, somebody who's done market access. And the thing is, one of the challenges is that the founder CEOs who came from that academic environment or from the preclinical stage, they want to continue to stay at the helm. And at some point, they actually get in their own way because they're no longer credible in the core emphasis of activity that the company is going to continue to perform. And they're struggling to attract investors, they're struggling to attract partners because of that.
Let's say someone finds themselves in that situation. What should they be doing? Like, is it a case of simply step aside? Do they need to find themselves another role internally? Is it that they become are they forced to move aside? Or what happens in that kind of situation where you see that?
So I think that, in order to address this, the leader has to think, about where they actually are strong and where they are not, right? And how do they build the strength around them from those angles? So the CEO might remain a CEO, but they might need to bring a development leader in the C-suite, right? If they are moving into clinical development, for example. Or they might need to bring a strong commercial leader if they're moving into commercialization. That's one way of doing it, right? The other way is to say, you know what? I am a researcher by nature. That's what makes me excited. I can learn maybe about commercialization, but that's not my thing. I have never done sales, and there is probably a reason why, right? So if that's the case, then stay in the area where you actually are happy and most productive. I mean, we all have only one life to live, right? Maybe, yes, cash out from that particular venture, start another company, or step down from the CEO role, turn yourself into the CSO so that you can continue doing what you are doing and, stay on the technology and science. There are multiple ways as to how you can address it. And look, I'll use one example. There is a well-known physician researcher, Daniel Drucker, out of Canada, who invented GLP-1s. Is Daniel Drucker running Novo Nordisk or Lilly? No. He stepped aside, licensed his invention to the companies who actually are specialized in the drug development and commercialization. Right. Is he, somehow lesser of a scientist or a person because of that? Absolutely not. He is well-renowned, inventor of that technology. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that looking at those examples probably gives you a good way of thinking about what the potential path forward is.
Yeah, nice. So what I'm hearing is you've mentioned a few times of recognizing what your strengths are, recognizing what your weaknesses are. There's a big piece here in being willing to honestly reflect, and maybe part the ego of wanting to drive the thing yourself and going, what's actually the best thing here for not just for the organization, but for the people that we're trying to affect and impact.
Right. And, at some point, the question is also what's the bigger goal here, right? Are you continuing to stay around just because you're so attached to that idea or that invention or that technology? Or have you set it up to actually see this thing getting to the bedside and getting to the hands of the patients and clinicians, right? To improve lives. If the first is the case, okay, you know what? Keep on babysitting it. And that's how we see companies that are, that have been established 15 years ago and they're still in preclinical. But if you think that you have done it for the bigger purpose of actually impacting well-being of the patients and their health, okay, then maybe step aside and see how this thing matures. And look, step aside, I'm not saying that, give up financial benefits from it. You can still maintain your shareholder position, right? So there are different ways of looking at it, but I think you just need to be honest with yourself as to why did you even get into this?
Nice. Well, let's change tack slightly, Stan, on around industry trends and what's happening in the market, particularly around sort of some of the early stage companies. Give us a bit of an idea of what you're seeing in terms of the trends for the space at the moment.
I mean, there's obviously a lot going on, especially if you look at the changes in the FDA, recent changes in the requirements for preclinical study. There are a lot of things that are happening, and the industry is trying to figure out how to react to this and what does that mean for the future. But generally speaking, there has been a pretty significant trend over the past, let's say, decade or so, where a lot of the large pharma companies actually exited research activity. I mean, there are research campuses that are standing vacant and empty, and there is a reason for this, because to do research, you actually need to excel in the area that you are working in. And it's very hard to maintain that cutting edge when you are moving from one project to another within the four walls of a large organization, right? You're better off looking at what other people are doing who have been specialized in this for a while, whether this is in academia or in other settings. and basically picking up what you think has the most potential. And that has changed the dynamic in the biotech field pretty significantly from the perspective that it used to be that, to be a successful biotech company, you need to carry the product to like phase 2. And then, once you got positive result, you're transactable and, some strategic partner will pick it up. These days, it actually is actually quite plausible to transact with a strategic at the preclinical stage. And that changed dramatically the outlook in terms of valuations, in terms of rigor requirements at preclinical stage, but it also changed the requirements on the profile of the leadership. Because if you look at some of the successful preclinical deals, they are very high value, but they're based on milestones that go all the way to the commercialization royalties. So now think about that, startup CEO who comes from, let's say, academia as a spin-off and, has done research their whole life. And now they need to discuss, sales force deployment, market access, and pricing to actually negotiate that agreement. I just don't know if everybody has that skill set, which that puts you into the situation where you continuously need to test the market for whether you are transactable or not and if there is interest, but you also need to make sure that you surround yourself with people who understand not just research, but the full life cycle of your product. Whether they're like internal people as your C-suite or, the investment bankers and strategic advisors like us, but you do need to have that much more comprehensive view and holistic view of what product life cycle does look like.
Okay. Okay. And how do you envisage that going forward as well? If that's a trend you've been seeing over the last sort of decade or so, what do you envisage that's going to look like over the coming years?
It probably will remain, but as usual, there are fancy trends, and there's actually strong underlying and consistent current, and you need to separate the two. So I think that as much as there is excitement about, well, I don't know, we have an AI platform for lead optimization. Okay, great. But then, everybody on their slides have a platform for lead optimization. I don't even know what that means anymore, right? And then, my God, we have cell and gene therapy. Everybody goes into cell and gene therapy up until a couple of years later, nobody does, right? So there are those kind of, flavor of the week kind of things. But generally speaking, you still need to stick to the fundamentals, meaning you need to have clear, validated, physiologically plausible targets. You need to have clear definition of how you are interacting with them. You need to be clear as to how you can translate this into a actually commercializable product. You need to think about what your clear R&D strategy is and so on, right? So that's why when I'm looking at the technology, what I'm looking for, and I think that that's pretty universal. First question that I'm always asking is, what is the clinical value? How is this, if it makes it to the market, how will this be disproportionately better to the clearly defined patient population than anything else that's out there? If you can answer that question, then let's talk about your technology. Is this technologically feasible? Can this be developed? And from there, okay, if you can develop it, can you actually get it approved? What's your regulatory strategy? What's the pathway? And the last thing is, okay, let's say you get it approved. How is it going to be commercialized? What's the pricing? What's the market size? What's the go-to-market model? I mean, just tell me those things. You don't need to have a lot of details about those things, but you need to have them thought through so that your story becomes credible and plausible. And then from there, I mean, people can put a lot of meat on those bones, but at least, if you have answered those 4 questions and addressed those 4 filters, you have a chance to succeed in whatever it is you're doing.
So it sounds, perhaps less of a new trend, more of a case of, are you filtering it through these 4 key decision-making criteria, and that will then influence what you do going forward, the decisions you make going
Correct.
forward. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because look,
Nice.
the challenge is that a lot of companies are started by the people who have deep expertise in a given area and have done a lot of research, not because they see a clear benefit of this thing, but because they can. Right? When I was in medical device industry, we had this term buttonology, where the engineers continue to develop features of the device as in, well, here's a new button, not because there is clarity as to who needs that button, if anybody will use that button, but because they can develop that button. And that's a scary thing to do, because that actually puts you in a very lengthy R&D path, consumes a lot of resources, and actually dilutes the value that you bring to the market.
And you don't even know whether it's a thing that's going to be beneficial, whether it's going to
It
actually
probably
help
is
you
a
achieve the outcome.
distraction as compared to other
Yeah.
things that you're putting out there.
Yeah. Makes sense. That makes sense. So given the way that the market is moving, given the complexity, given various economic factors at the moment, what do you think for somebody that's perhaps at their um, mid to senior point in their career, what should they be doing if they want a pathway to leadership? What should they be thinking about in order to stay current, to stay relevant, and to kind of increase their chances, if you like, of making the progress they want to make to kind of rise up through the ranks towards the top?
I mean, that really depends on the organization. There are organizations that favor kind of linear progression within a function, right? So you've been a sales rep, you became a district sales manager, you became a sales director, you moved into the office, and you keep on going through that ladder up until you become a head of business unit, right? Or a CEO. Okay, great. There are other organizations that actually favor cross-functional pathways in the careers where, listen, you've been in medical, okay, great. Why don't you go for a rotation into sales or into marketing organization? And then you've been there. Now you know what does it look like on the clinical and the commercial side. Do you want to? And I mean, they rotate people through those roles. And although every time you do this kind of rotation, you're taking incremental risk, at the end of the day, you get to learn a lot of new stuff. And I think that, if you look at the reasons for why people stay with the organizations, ability to learn is actually one of the leading parameters that keeps people engaged. So if that's what's motivating to the individual, that's great. I think that where the challenge arises is where there is a mismatch, where the person wants to learn cross-functional dynamics and they're being boxed into a particular function because this is how that organization values the capabilities and supports development. At that point, look, I mean, you learned what you could learn from this organization. It's time to graduate. I mean, you don't need to burn the bridges and fight everybody. I mean, listen, it's like going to school. You learn what you have learned, graduate, go do something else. And this is where, you need to take decisions whether, the environment that you are in is conducive to your further development, career progression, or you need to find another environment. And you also have to be cognizant that environments change both externally and internally within the company. Company that you might join might not be the company that you're in, 5, 6 years later. Although the name is the same and the logo is the same, it's not the same organization anymore. You also need to consider that within larger organizations, there are subcultures, right? One group might be functioning very differently from another group. So maybe you don't need to leave the company, but you may want to transition to a different group that matches better your profile and your interests. So what I'm trying to say is that you need to keep options, but you need to be intentional about how do you navigate through them. So that's kind of, my thinking about it. But again, you have to think as to what's your destination, where you're heading, because if you don't know what's the destination, how do you know what you're right?
This is a really important topic. I think that last piece there, a lot of the advice that is coming up from people on the podcast is be intentional in your career. Make a decision. What is it that you really want from the future of your career? Make your decision and align your decisions based on that. An
Sorry, before,
organization.
before you ask the question, maybe just one additional nuance there. Being intentional in terms of what you want does not mean that you can then programmatically predict the future and go there step by step. Things happen in the world as a function of time, place, and circumstance. And being intentional means that you are still opportunistic, but you know what opportunities would you favor versus not.
It's more about having a North Star as opposed to follow the sequential.
Correct. It's not a clear charted path. It's the question of what choices do you favor on this path as the opportunities present themselves.
And that's
What
the
kind of
importance.
opportunities do you want to create?
Yeah, no, and that's the importance as well when people think about their careers, not just thinking about the next step, but zooming out far enough to think into the future of where they ultimately want to get to. Because the next step might not make sense in isolation, but it might make sense in terms of the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
And then I think the point you're making on learning being the reason people stay in an organization is a really important one for organizations to be thinking about as well, especially with the amount of talent that the amount of people that are reaching retirement age versus the amount of talent that's coming into the industry. There's a disparity there between what's leaving, what's coming in, and so organizations do need to think more carefully about how they retain people in the organization, retain that knowledge, even if it means moving them sideways to get that experience. At least they've got the context of the organization. You're keeping hold of that knowledge and giving people those opportunities, because it is harder to find people with the knowledge and with the experience. It is harder to find good quality people. So you've got to do more to retain the people that have that attitude, even if it's not the role they want to do anymore. They might be better placed elsewhere.
Right. So maybe, a couple of thoughts on this. One is that you talked about quality of people. I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit of a dreamer, but I don't think that there are, innately bad people. There are people who are in the wrong circumstance, where their talent is not leveraged, their capabilities are not leveraged, right? And I think that if you have somebody who is not performing well in your organ, that's the conversation to have. Listen, it's not like you have all the weaknesses, you have certain strength. Where can the strength be better applied than your current role? And that's when you start talking about training and career transition rather than exiting somebody, right? So that's one. The other thing is you talk about talent as in, people with certain knowledge and skills. But I think you need to think about culture and you need to think about the context of strategic priorities around it. I think I've shared with you this example, but just to summarize, I've lived through the situation where we had a very highly performing team, but unfortunately, the market has shifted and we needed to change the strategy. And that strategy required totally different set of skills, expertise, and interests, right? And so what happens is, although we had great people, these people were no longer fitting the strategy and the culture that was required for the strategy to succeed. And, unfortunately, that led to losing half of that team. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that, yes, we brought in the right, the better matching skills into the team and it was a successful thing. But I keep on thinking about half of that team that were strong performers, great people who were no longer fitting. And so I think that as a leader who is continuously challenged to navigate the company to success and might need to take those decisions because of the changing environment, we always need to think as to how do we support these people who, for no fault of theirs, are now finding themselves not matching anymore. How do we support them in their journey for their successful career? Whether this is staying within the organization or transitioning out of the organization. But the question is, we have to think about that team and those people. They were committed to us. We have to be committed to them.
Okay, so Stan, if you're reflecting on your own career and you were going to go back and give yourself a bit of advice earlier in your career, would you what piece of advice would you really want to give yourself and why?
Patience.
Go on, tell us more.
Well, the thing is, I have the tendency to try to quickly figure things out and get to the desired outcome now. Instant gratification is absolutely paramount. It's just, it has to be there. So wouldn't it be nice to come up with an idea and then, magically have things materialize and it's already, there and implemented.
Can you think of any times where that held you back?
Absolutely, yes, because that creates a mismatch between the expectations of people you work with, real time, real constraints and capabilities of the processes, environments, and so on, and your own expectations, right? And when you have that kind of tension being developed between those parameters, you end up in the situation where things are going great, but you're frustrated, right? And you don't want to be in that context because one, you are not as happy as you should be with what's going on, right? But then that level of, stress or anxiety gets transmitted to the rest of the team and for no good reason, right? So I think having a bit more of the patient, reflective and step back kind of approach definitely would have benefited me, especially in the earlier phases of the career.
A nice philosophical answer that.
But it's not being philosophical. It's just, as we accumulate the experiences, we obviously reflect on them. And the question is, can you translate that reflection to, the way you operate?
If you were going to give people advice now about making a significant impact in the industry, so these aspiring leaders that perhaps we talked about earlier, what advice would you give to them?
I think the first and the main one would be think about the higher purpose. I mean, we always have to go through the day. There are always tons of emails over there. Think about what is it that you actually trying to impact? Why are you doing things? If you can answer the why, then your priorities become clear. That's probably key, and it's true professionally, but you also have to reflect on it personally, because we always have trade-offs. And the last thing you want is to say, you know what, I'm doing something for the benefit of humanity, but by the way, I completely forgot about my family. Right? And the other way around is true too. So, I mean, you need to think as to why do you do things and how does that why balances your priorities within the professional life. There are multiple, and between your professional and personal life.
Awesome. Stan, else would you want our audience to hear? Whatever floor is open, what else would you want our audience to hear from you? What else do you think would be valuable?
I think that the idea of making sure that you are clear in terms of what you actually enjoy doing, and then how do you translate that into the value to the others, is the key thing to being successful in whatever it is that you do, right? Because you might be good at something, but you absolutely hate it, right? So you might be not good at something, but this is what's requested of you, and you're struggling to figure out how to get better at this. And I think building on your strength is absolutely paramount to be successful, rather than continuously trying to figure out how do you address your weaknesses, as long as those weaknesses are not total derailers, right? So building on your strength, making sure that you enjoy what they deliver, but also think as to why do you even bother doing it? What is the broader impact? How does that generate value? If you can answer those questions, I think, doesn't matter what you do, you will be successful.
I am a big advocate for, and I've always been a big advocate for, I say always, if not always, probably the last 5-6 years, a big advocate for journaling and getting your thoughts down on paper. This sounds like a perfect exercise for somebody to sit down, pen and paper, and actually do a little bit of an audit of themselves and ask themselves some of these bigger questions and make sure that they are aligned and heading in the right direction. Listen to Stan's advice, get a pen and paper, jot down some of these around what's your why, what's your purpose, where you're heading, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and how do you utilize those as effectively as possible to get towards that kind of purpose, that outcome. So pen and paper at the ready, for sure.
Or a digital screen with the stylus, whatever works.
Yeah, there is that. Yeah, whatever works. Whatever works. Sit down and have a chat with the AI about it. Stan, thanks a lot for your time. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think there's some real, really gives some context to people out there about, what's going on, what they should be looking at as a leader. We've got some practical stuff for them, as well as a bit of an idea on what's happening out there in the market as well. So really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for spending the time to share your wisdom.
Appreciate the invitation. Thanks for your questions.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Leaders of Life Sciences. We hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to lead with clarity and purpose. If you're hiring, building your leadership team, or thinking about your next move, we'd love to support you. You'll find everything you need to get in touch in the show notes. And if you enjoyed the show, please follow and share it with someone who'd find it valuable. Until next time, keep leading forward.